Hello everybody and welcome to this, my second of two videos on the Leica IIIB. Alright, let's finish going through this camera and we're going to talk about how to do everything that this camera can do photographically. Well, all of the functions it has, what it can do photographically is truly up to your creative vision. First thing we're going to do is talk about how to mount and unmount lenses on this camera. It uses the Leica thread mount LTM39 thread mount. This is the same thread size and pitch as in larger lenses, but in larger lenses won't work. I believe that there's also a Russian-made lens in the in the 39mm thread mount for SLR versions of their Zorkis. Those also will not work on this. I used to have one of those. I don't anymore, so I can't just demonstrate it, unfortunately, but you'll have to trust me. If you want to use a non-Leica lens, you can. I have on this one right here a Zorki lens, same exact spec as the Elmar right here, and this one works just fine, focuses properly on my other Leica. So anything LTM39 will work. If it's M39, it won't, theoretically. Just double check, if you're unfamiliar, double check the internet for a lens before you buy it. To remove the lens, well, first thing, some of the lenses are expandable, right? And what we need to do with those expandable lenses is pull them out, and now this lens is ready to take photos. But to remove it and unmount it, we're going to just turn it counter or anti-clockwise. Sometimes it feels like the camera's going to break right before it starts to unthread, but it won't, at least it hasn't. Now we've removed the lens from the camera. To put a new one in, we just go grab the other lens, and we just start threading it into the mount until the threads grip the raceways. There we go. Thread it all the way until it seats. And if you have this lens, at least this is the way it should look when it's fully mounted. I would assume, only actually ever having owned this lens, that the focusing arm for other lenses would also be in the same basic place. Now that we've learned how to switch lenses as we need to, next thing we're going to do is talk about how to load film. Just making sure, no film. Okay. To get into the camera, we lift up this little ring here and we turn it from zoo to off, and we pull off the bottom of the camera like that. We now need to remove the film take-up spool right here. Now if you use film like this will very possibly jam your camera and could damage the shutter. So film that has a short little leader cut out like this is not to be used in these cameras. Okay, that's not a negotiable thing. If you value your Leica, you will not do that. I'm going to show you a couple things you can do. The first thing is you could buy, hopefully well into the future this will continue to be true, Svema film from Astrum in the Ukraine rather, and I just happen to have a roll here, quite fortunately. Svema comes with this long leader. This is the leader shape that's needed for Leica cameras. Okay, so not everyone happens to have a somewhat obscure Ukrainian 35mm film sitting around. So I'm going to put this guy back. So let's say that you don't have any Astrum film. What you can do is grab any old film that you're going to put into this camera and a pair of scissors or a razor, and we're just going to make this tongue a whole lot longer. That looks like that's probably an appropriate length. There we go. So what I did was I cut straight down there, and then I just angled the scissors up at the end. You don't want to have some sort of like cut overhang here. You want to make this as smooth as possible, because if you have like a loose piece of cut film here, like a little edge or something, that could jam in the camera's shutter. So to load film, now that we've got the leader cut, we're going to take this long leader and we're going to find the arrow on the take-up spool right there. And we're going to press the film into that arrow until it feels like it's really well in there. Okay. We'll take up a little bit of slack here. That works a little bit better. And what you want to do when you slide your film into the camera is have it look about like this. Okay? Oops. About like this. We're going to press the film, well, not really press, insert the film into the camera this way. Now it's been loaded. There we go. Okay. Next we're going to take the film rewind lever and we're going to turn it from rewind to advance. And we're going to arm the shutter. Everything felt good so far. But for those of you who may just be starting off with this type of camera, I'm going to show you a really easy way to see if what you're doing is correct. I set the shutter speed to Z, okay, right up here, which is going to be our bulb mode. I've removed the lens, opened the shutter curtain, and now you can see the film in there. And I'm not completely happy with how that looks, so I'm just going to reach in there. Only do this if you're very confident in yourself, and just kind of push the film down a little bit so that I'm not seeing any of the sprocket holes on the bottom. Release the shutter and advance. Okay. Now, still not completely properly aligned. I'm going to try that again. But the good news is that the leader has disappeared, meaning that the film is advancing smoothly. So at this point, everything should be good to go, and we can take photos. However, this is a ruined roll of film, so we're going to see if it's actually still moving through there correctly. And now it is fairly properly aligned. I mean, look, these are really old cameras. Perfect alignment is going to be, it'll work itself out after a few shots. At any rate, those shots would have been the ones that we would have wasted anyway, advancing the film. And now that we have advanced the film a few frames, what we want to do is rotate this dial, the frame count dial, to 1. From wherever we were, we're going to put it on 1, and that's going to let us know we're on our first frame. We'll just make sure that any slack that's in the film is taken out by turning this the direction of the arrow. It's not moving at all, so there's no slack to be taken out. Okay. Now we're set to go and ready to start taking photos. I'm going to show you really quickly what's going on, the best that I can with this camera, inside as we're taking photos. Oops, let go of that too soon. So if I hold the shutter button open, you can see there that light has been recorded on the film. Shutter closes after the exposure. We're going to advance the film. Hey, look at that, fresh film. So basically what's happened is that the film is being taken up by the take-up spool over here, being pulled out of the cassette as it goes. So when we take a photo, watch the knob here, or after we take a photo, you can see the knob here is spinning in the opposite direction of the arrow. That's because whenever we advance the film, it's being taken out of the cassette right here. Okay. When we go to rewind the film later after we're done taking all of our photos, we hit the rewind lever right here. Tension comes out of the shutter mechanism, and now we can lift this a little bit and start rewinding the film. So when we finish taking all of our photos, it's then time to rewind it. If you want to rewind it like a pro, you hold the camera, well, you'll have the lens on the camera, of course, but you'll hold the camera like this, and you rewind it like that. Okay? So your motion is to turn your hand this way at the same time that you're rotating the camera that way, and then you rewind the film twice as quickly. Just like that. Okay. So we can put the lens back on for safety, for shutter safety. There we go. Once you have rewound the film, it'll feel like it's a little bit different now at that point. Just going to close that, open the film back, and the film has been completely taken up, and you can now go about your day shooting, loading another roll of film and continuing shooting, or if you're done shooting for the day, just make sure that you have set the rewind so that there's no tension on the film, and you are good to go. Okay, so we've changed lenses, we've loaded and unloaded film, we've seen how that works and how it works properly. I'm not going to demonstrate how loading film works improperly, by the way. I do value these cameras. Next thing we're going to do is talk about how to use a flash with this camera. Interesting. There's no electronic contact in the hot shoe there. Okay, so there must be another way to connect the flash, right? Like a PC port on the front of the camera? No. So unless you have a camera that was factory upgraded by Leitz at some point in the past when they were still doing this, these cameras have no flash port on them at all, which means there's only one way to do flash. That's what's called bulb mode shooting, or however you want to phrase it. What you need to do to use flash with this camera, unless it's been factory upgraded, of course, is set your shutter speed to Z, which is the flash shutter speed. I'll turn this around to make it easier to see for you. Z right there. What you do with Z, as we've demonstrated before, is you push the shutter button down, the shutter stays open for as long as you hold it down, and then when you release it, the shutter closes. This gives you the ability to trigger a flash while you're holding the shutter button down. So what you could do is, if you're, let's say, in a dark space, hold the shutter button down, trigger your flash whenever you're happy with it, and then release your shutter button. Or let's say that you have one of these and you have a friend coming into the frame and you have some lights on them. They can run through the frame or ride their bike or whatever, and then you can control when you start the exposure and when you end the exposure, and at what point in that exposure time you manually trigger your flash by pressing the test button on it. So basically, as long as you're in bulb mode, you have complete creative control over the flash of this camera. The one limitation is you have to be in bulb mode. So for taking photos after dark, in an unlit room, extreme macros or microscopy, things like that, it's really not an issue. It's only an issue if you're out in daylight and want to use a flash. You're kind of out of luck then. So there's that. But realistically, it's fine. I mean, these are still really awesome cameras. Flash is always an optional thing, not mandatory. All right, so what about using a light meter with this camera? Well, it doesn't have one built in, doesn't even have batteries. So there are a couple of different ways you can meter a scene for a photo. You can use the Sunny 16 rule. Let's say that you are here on your lens and you set it to f16, which is actually not marked on this lens. It goes up to f18, so we'll pretend that's 16. That's within the film's tolerance, okay? And let's say that we're using a 100 ISO film. What we want to do is set the shutter speed to 1/100th of a second. In full sun, with the sun behind you, when you have your film speed and your aperture set to f16, your shutter speed will be the same number as your film speed. So if we were using 400 ISO film in full sun with the sun to our back at f16, we would go to 1/500th of a second. And that would give us a pretty darn close to proper exposure. So that's basically the way that the Sunny 16 rule works. The other thing that you can do, of course, is use a handheld light meter or a light meter app on your smartphone. Get the readings based on your lighting, specific lighting conditions, your settings. Dial them into the shutter speed dial and the aperture yourself, and then trust your light meter. So those are the two ways to use a light meter with this camera. So now that we've talked about everything that you really can do with this camera, let's talk about how to take a photo with it. Okay, so we're going to advance the film because now we're ready to take a photo. We've gotten our light meter reading, and we know that with our lighting conditions, we're at 1/200th of a second and f6.3. Okay, f5.6 because I overshot 6.3. Okay. Now what you're going to do is you're going to look through the viewfinder windows right here. The viewfinder window on the right is the one that has your scene. So when you look through here, what you see here is about what would be on your film, roughly, if you have a 50mm lens mounted on your camera. The one on the left is your fine focus window. So with the one on the left, what you do is you find the thing in your frame that you want to have be properly focused. You dial in your focus with your lens, and when your rangefinder lines up, which means what happens is when you look through that focusing window, you'll see two images that are identical, slightly misaligned. When they're properly aligned, then what is aligned is now in focus. So you focus with this window. Once you have proper focus, you move your eye right back to the framing window and take your picture as soon as you're happy with your composition. So you dial in all of your camera settings first. You compose roughly. You focus to get critical focus accurate. And then you compose to verify your composition, framing, verticals, horizontals, whatever. And then you take your picture whenever you're ready to do so. And that's how we take a picture with this camera. It's actually pretty easy to do once you know what settings you have to dial in. It's the quintessential full manual camera. But what about double exposures? Ooh, could you even do a double exposure with this camera? Well, it's in the outline with a process, and I'm teasing it, so I'm going to guess the answer is yes. And spoiler alert, the answer is yes. Now, the way that film works is that your film inside of your camera can record a certain number of photons. And what happens is that when all of the photons it can absorb have been absorbed, it reaches what's called density maximum. And as your film approaches density maximum, your images that turn out well are not anywhere close to that. As it approaches density maximum, your images will become very dark, thick, or dense. And that basically just is a fancy way of saying that the film received too many photons. So, if film is designed so that if you have f5.6 and 1/100th of a second, and that's a proper shutter speed and aperture for your lighting conditions with your film, then that's going to give you a proper exposure. If you do that twice, f5.6, 1/125th, 1/125th for your double exposure, it's going to be too many photons. And that's going to lead your negative to be dense, dark, or thick. Those three words that mean it has too many photons. The consequence of that is that in digitization, a thick negative will give you more digital noise and less contrast, and harder to recover contrast. In darkroom printing, you'll have much longer print times and significantly reduced contrast. So, when you do a double exposure, you want to compensate for that by cutting the amount of light reaching your film in half for each of the double exposures. The way to do that is there's two ways, either with the aperture or the shutter speed. So let's say you're at f5.6, which is roughly what we're at right now. If you want to cut the amount of light in half, you need to adjust the aperture dial. And that would be f8, which f9, pretty close. It's marked on this lens. If you were at f6.3 to f9, same thing. Anyway, basically what you need to do to cut the amount of light in half with a lens like this is make the aperture opening smaller. By doing that, you reduce the amount of light reaching the film. Okay, but I'm really particular about my apertures, and I don't want to adjust the f5.6. That is perfect for me, f5.6 and 1/100th. So, in that case, in the way that I generally do double exposures, I adjust the aperture, the shutter speed rather. So we know that, there we go, I just goofed. Okay, so we know that 1/100th of a second is a proper shutter speed with f/5.6 for a single exposure. If we want to cut the amount of light reaching the film in half with the shutter speed, we have to adjust it. If you guessed 1/200th, you would have guessed correctly. These are fractions, so the higher the number, the less time. 1/200th of a second is half as much time as 1/100th. So that would be the first frame of our double exposure right there. Now, the next thing that you need to do to rearm, now if you just start advancing the film, oh shoot, we've actually just rearmed the shutter and advanced the film. We don't have a double exposure anymore. We just have a single underexposed image. Okay, let's try this again. Shutter button. You can let go of the shutter button if you want to, but the next thing you're going to have to do is hold the shutter button down, and we're going to have to spin the shutter dial counterclockwise until it clicks into place. And you cannot let go of the dial when you're doing this, because it will just do what it just did there and go back into the fired position. There we go. Once it clicks into place, then you release the shutter button. Now what you've done by that is that you have used the shutter dial to manually rearm the shutter without the frame advance being, without the film being advanced with the frame advance knob right here. So you've now taken your finger off the shutter speed dial and the shutter button. Now you take your second shot. That's all there is to it. That's how you do a double exposure with these cameras. It's really pretty simple. It's a good mechanism if you're comfortable with it. And then once you're done with your double exposure, you advance the film. And because none of the gearing has been messed up in here, you don't need to take a dead frame as you do on many, many, many other models of camera. So I will say I generally don't like doing double exposures on my 3B bodies simply because they're old. It's not necessarily taxing on them, but I do always worry, for no good reason, that doing that will cause them to jam. So honestly, if you want to do double exposures on 35mm, I'd bypass the really old cameras just as a rule, not just the Leicas, but all really old cameras, and look at something from the 80s or 90s and do your multiple exposures with that. That's all. That's the only advice I've got for you on that. So at any rate, that was my second of my 2 videos about these absolutely amazing and beautiful and completely enjoyable to use and carry Leica 3B cameras. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next video manuals. Thank you everyone for watching. If this video was helpful and useful to you, please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know that I'm on the right track and that I'm producing and creating content which is helpful to you. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please leave those in the comments section below. I'm pretty good about responding every couple of days and answering whatever questions you have to the best of my ability. If you'd like to subscribe to find out when I have more videos about how to use cameras, photographic techniques, or the best practices for the tools of the trade, by all means please subscribe and check that notifications bell to be alerted when new content arrives. If you'd like to support the channel by joining with a membership, there are now membership options for this channel at different tiers that will give you different benefits if you would be interested in that. And one last thing, thank you everyone very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next videos. Won't we, Steinbeck? What's that look about?